The telegram sat on Grant Holloway's kitchen table for 3 days before he could bring himself to open it. He had walked past it a dozen times. He had moved it from one side of the table to the other when he needed space to set down his coffee. He had watched dust settle on the yellow paper while the morning sun crept across the worn wooden surface. But he had not opened it. Grant knew what it would say. He could feel it in his bones the same way he could feel a storm coming across the Colorado plains. Something in the weight of that envelope, in the way the telegraph operator had avoided his eyes when handing it over, told him everything he needed to know. Still, knowing and accepting were two different things. On the fourth morning, with the autumn wind rattling the windows and the smell of cold coffee filling the kitchen, Grant finally sat down and tore the seal. The words blurred together like ink in rain. Unable to come. Circumstances changed. Sincerest apologies. He read it twice, then a third time. The message did not change. Catherine Mills was not coming. Grant crumpled the paper in his fist and stared at the two small faces watching him from the doorway. Emma was 7 years old. Her brown hair hung in tangles from another restless night, and one small hand gripped her younger brother's shoulder with a protectiveness that made Grant's chest ache. She had become the little mother of this house in ways no child should have to be. Thomas was barely 5. He had their mother's eyes, gray as storm clouds over the mountains, and far too serious for a boy his age. He had not smiled since the funeral. Not once. The three of them had been living in silence for 6 months now. Ever since Sarah died, they had stumbled through their days like wounded animals, never speaking about the empty chair at the dinner table or the bedroom that still smelled faintly of lavender. The mail-order bride was supposed to fix everything. Grant had spent weeks writing that letter to Catherine Mills in St. Louis. He had described the ranch, the children, the good life he could offer. He had promised security and stability. He had not mentioned love because he was not sure he had any left to give. She had written back with careful words about fresh starts and faith. Her penmanship was neat and precise. She seemed practical and kind. Grant had sent money for the train ticket. Now that money was gone, and so was his plan. Papa. Emma's voice was small and tentative in the morning stillness. Grant smoothed the crumpled telegram against his thigh and then folded it into quarters. He tucked it into his shirt pocket where he would not have to look at it anymore. Is the lady coming? No, sweetheart. He kept his voice steady even though something inside him was cracking. She is not coming. Thomas started crying. It was the quiet kind of crying that barely made a sound. The kind of tears that fell from a child who had learned that loud grief made adults uncomfortable. Emma pulled her brother close, wrapping her thin arms around him like she could shield him from everything bad in the world. Grant watched them and felt the weight of his failure crushing down on his chest like a fallen tree. He was 34 years old. He owned 12,200 acres of good grazing land outside of Redemption Flats, Colorado. He had built this house with his own hands and his father's help. He had survived drought and blizzards and cattle prices that nearly bankrupted him twice. But he could not figure out how to braid his daughter's hair. He could not remember which foods his son would actually eat. The cattle got fed every morning without fail. The horses were groomed and healthy. His hired hands knew their work and did it well. His children got whatever he could manage, and it never felt like enough. Come here, Grant opened his arms. They rushed to him instantly. Emma and Thomas pressed their small bodies against his chest, trembling with fears they could not name. He held them tight and breathed in the smell of their hair and tried to remember the last time Sarah had held them all like this. We will figure it out. He spoke the words into the top of Emma's head. We always do. But he did not know how. He truly did not know. The house around them felt hollow and cold despite the fire he had built that morning. Sarah had been its heartbeat. Without her, the rooms echoed with emptiness. Dust gathered in corners she would never have tolerated. Cobwebs stretched across the ceiling beams. The smell of old coffee and wood smoke clung to every surface because Grant did not know how to make it smell like home again. He held his children until Thomas stopped crying and Emma's grip on his shirt loosened. Then he stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers and did what he had done every morning for the past 6 months. He went to work. The cattle would not feed themselves. The fence in the north pasture still needed mending. The ranch hands would have questions about the autumn roundup. Life did not stop just because your heart was broken. Grant learned that lesson when Sarah died. He was learning it again now. But as he walked out to the barn with the telegram burning a hole in his pocket, he allowed himself one moment of honest despair. He had hoped Catherine Mills would save them. Not just the children, him too. He had hoped she would bring order to this chaos and warmth to these cold rooms, and maybe even something like happiness back into their lives. Instead, he had a crumpled piece of paper and an empty train ticket and two children who needed more than he knew how to give. The sun was rising over the mountains when Grant saddled his horse and rode out to check on the herd. The sky turned pink and gold and beautiful, the way it always did in Colorado in the autumn. Sarah would have loved this sunrise. She would have made him stop and watch it with her. Grant did not stop. He kept riding until the house disappeared behind him, and he could pretend for a few hours that he was just a rancher with cattle to tend and nothing else to worry about. But even out on the range, with the wind in his face and the endless sky above him, he could not escape the truth. He needed help, and he had no idea where to find it. 2 days after the telegram arrived, Grant rode into Redemption Flats with a list of supplies and a headache that would not quit. The town sprawled along the base of Red Rock Hills, its wooden storefronts bleached gray by years of wind and sun. It was not much to look at. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings that served the ranchers and farmers scattered across the valley. But it was home. Grant had been coming here since he was a boy, riding alongside his father. Wagner's General Store stood at the corner of Main and 4th Street. The porch was crowded with barrels of nails and sacks of grain and all the other necessities of ranch life. A cat slept in a patch of sunlight near the door. Grant tied his horse to the rail and stepped inside. The smell hit him first, leather and tobacco and something sweet like penny candy. The store had smelled exactly the same for as long as he could remember. Grant Holloway. Mrs. Wagner's voice rang out from behind the counter. She was a stout woman with silver hair pinned up in a bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had known Grant since he was in short pants. She had known Sarah too. Mrs. Wagner had attended the funeral and brought a casserole that sat untouched in the icebox until it went bad. "Heard about your mail-order bride." Her voice carried across the store without a hint of discretion. Real shame, news traveled fast in small towns. Grant had learned that lesson a long time ago. He pulled his hat lower and pretended to study a display of canned goods. "Appreciate the concern, ma'am." Was not concern. Mrs. Wagner set down the ledger she had been writing in. "Was gossip. But since you are here, there is a woman looking for work." Grant picked up a tin of coffee and studied the label like it contained the secrets of the universe. "I am not looking for a housekeeper." "You should be." Mrs. Wagner came around the counter. She was shorter than Grant by a good foot, but she had a presence that made most men think twice about arguing with her. "Those children of yours need someone, and you are running yourself ragged trying to do it all alone. I can see it in your face. You look 10 years older than you did before Sarah passed." Grant set the coffee down harder than he intended. "I manage fine, you manage poorly." Mrs. Wagner crossed her arms. "There is a difference. Now this woman came into town yesterday asking about housekeeping positions. Her name is Adelaide Brennan. Irish, I think, though her accent is not strong anymore. She is staying at the boarding house. Why would an Irish woman be looking for work in Redemption Flats?" Mrs. Wagner shrugged. "Why does anyone end up anywhere? She has references from a family back east. Philadelphia, respectable people from what I could tell. She worked for them for several years before they moved to France." Grant thought about Emma's tangled hair and Thomas's untouched breakfast plates. He thought about the pile of laundry that had grown so large he was considering just burning it all and starting fresh. He thought about the dust and the cobwebs and the silence that filled every room of his house. "Where is this boarding house?" Mrs. Wagner smiled like a cat that had caught a mouse. 2 blocks east, Mrs. Kimball's place. Blue shutters. You cannot miss it." Grant bought the coffee and a few other supplies he did not really need. He loaded them into his saddlebags and stood in the street for a long moment, staring east toward the boarding house. The smart thing to do would be to go home. He did not need a stranger in his house. He did not need another woman trying to fill the space that Sarah had left behind. But Emma had cried herself to sleep again last night because he could not get the tangles out of her hair without hurting her. And Thomas had started wetting the bed, something he had not done since he was 3 years old. Grant's pride was not worth his children's suffering. He walked the 2 blocks to Mrs. Kimball's boarding house. The building was exactly as Mrs. Wagner described, a 2-story wooden structure with blue shutters and a wide porch. Respectable, but not fancy. The kind of place where people stayed when they were between one life and the next. A woman stood on the porch with her arms crossed against the morning chill. She was maybe 26 or 27 years old. Her hair was auburn, pinned back in a simple knot that had started to come loose. Her dress was dark green and had clearly seen better days, but it was clean and neatly mended. Her face was angular and pretty in a tired way, like she had not slept well in a long time. When she saw Grant approaching, her expression shifted from weariness to cautious hope. Mr. Holloway. It was not a question. She had been expecting him. Mrs. Wagner must have sent word ahead. Yes, ma'am. Grant stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and removed his hat. The morning sun caught the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. Heard you are looking for work. I am. Her voice carried a faint lilt, the echo of Ireland softened by years in America. It was pleasant to listen to, not harsh or demanding. Housekeeping, cooking, childcare. I am capable with all 3. You have references? Adelaide descended the porch steps and produced a folded letter from her pocket. The paper was worn at the creases from being handled too many times. She held it out to him like an offering. Grant took the letter and scanned its contents. Reliable, trustworthy, excellent with children. The words were written in an elegant hand and signed by a Mrs. Theodore Ashford of Philadelphia. Why did you leave? Adelaide's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. If Grant had not been watching her closely, he might have missed it. The family moved to France. I could not follow. There was more to the story. Grant could tell. But then again, everyone had secrets. He had his own. The work is hard. Grant folded the letter and handed it back to her. 2 children, 7 and 5. The house needs everything. Cooking, cleaning, laundry. My daughter needs someone who can do her hair proper. My son is struggling with his mama being gone. He paused, watching her face for any sign of hesitation. Pays $20 a month plus room and board. Adelaide's eyes widened slightly. $20 was generous for housekeeping work, and they both knew it. Most families paid half that. But Grant was not most families. He was desperate, and desperate men paid premium prices. When would you need me to start? Tomorrow, if you are willing. Adelaide looked past him toward the dusty street and the mountains rising in the distance. The wind caught a loose strand of her hair and blew it across her face. She pushed it back with work-roughened fingers. Then she looked at Grant again. Really looked, like she was trying to see past his weathered exterior to whatever lay beneath. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her. I will be ready at dawn. The children hated her at first. Grant had expected resistance. Emma and Thomas had built walls around themselves in the months since their mother died, and they were not about to let some stranger walk through those walls uninvited. But knowing it would happen and watching it happen were 2 different things. On Adelaide's first morning, she arrived before sunrise in a clean dress with her hair pinned back in the same simple style. Grant showed her around the house, pointing out the kitchen and the children's rooms and the back door that stuck in humid weather. She listened and nodded and asked practical questions about meal preferences and laundry schedules. Then Emma came downstairs. The girl stopped in the doorway and stared at Adelaide with undisguised hostility. Her brown hair was a tangled mess that Grant had failed to comb for 3 days. Her nightgown was stained with something that might have been jam. Who is she? Emma's voice was flat and cold. This is Miss Brennan. Grant kept his tone gentle. She is going to help us with the house and with cooking and such. We do not need help. Emma crossed her arms in a perfect imitation of Mrs. Wagner. Grant would have laughed if the situation were not so heartbreaking. Adelaide crouched down to Emma's level. Her movements were slow and careful, like approaching a spooked horse. You must be Emma. Your father told me about you. He said you are very smart and very brave. Emma's eyes narrowed. I do not want you here. Adelaide nodded like this was perfectly reasonable. I understand. I am a stranger, and strangers are hard to trust, but I am not here to replace anyone. I am just here to help with the things that are hard to do alone. Emma stared at her for a long moment. Then she turned and ran back upstairs without another word. Grant rubbed the back of his neck. She will come around, eventually. Of course she will. Adelaide rose to her feet with a small smile. The resistance did not seem to bother her at all. Children protect themselves the only way they know how, by pushing away anything that might hurt them. She has good instincts. Thomas was worse. The boy refused to come out of his room for most of the first day. When Adelaide brought him lunch, he hid under his bed and would not respond, no matter how gently she spoke. Grant found her sitting outside Thomas's door that evening, her back against the wall and her eyes closed. He will not eat. Adelaide's voice was tired but not defeated. I left the plate where he can reach it when he is ready. But he will not take anything from my hands. Give him time. Grant sat down beside her in the hallway. The floorboards creaked under his weight. Sarah was the one he was closest to. She could always make him laugh when the rest of us could not reach him. When she died, something in him just shut down. Adelaide opened her eyes and looked at him. What was she like? Your wife. Grant had not talked about Sarah in months. The words felt rusty in his throat. She was patient, more patient than me. She could spend an hour coaxing Thomas out of one of his moods and never lose her temper once. And she loved this place. The ranch, the mountains, all of it. She said Colorado was where her soul could finally breathe. It sounds like she was a wonderful woman. She was. Grant stood up before the conversation could go any deeper. I will be in the barn if you need anything. He walked away and did not look back, but he felt Adelaide's eyes following him down the hall. The first week was a battle of wills that Adelaide seemed determined to lose gracefully. Emma refused to let her touch her hair. Every morning the girl would scream that only Mama could do it right, and every morning Adelaide would step back and let her be. Thomas continued hiding whenever Adelaide came near. He would eat the food she left for him, but only after she was out of sight. Grant watched from the edges, torn between wanting to intervene and trusting Adelaide to know what she was doing. She never raised her voice. She never forced anything. She just kept showing up. Every morning, Adelaide would cook eggs the way Thomas liked them, scrambled soft with a little cheese. She would leave them on a plate at the bottom of the stairs where he could find them. Every morning, she would braid her own hair at the kitchen table, her fingers moving slowly and deliberately, while Emma watched from the doorway with suspicious eyes. Grant did not understand the strategy until the end of the first week. Emma came downstairs earlier than usual that morning. Adelaide was at the table as always, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders as she began the braiding process. Emma watched for a long moment. Then she climbed onto the chair across from Adelaide. Could you teach me? Adelaide's hands paused mid-braid. Teach you what, sweetheart? The braiding. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. I want to learn how to do it myself, so I do not need anyone to do it for me. Adelaide smiled, and for the first time since she had arrived, the tiredness in her face seemed to lift. I would be honored. Grant stood in the hallway listening to Adelaide's patient instructions and Emma's frustrated sighs, and finally the quiet triumph when the braid held together. Something in his chest loosened, just a fraction, just enough to let him breathe a little easier. Thomas took longer, but by the middle of the second week, something began to change. The boy started following Adelaide around the house like a shadow. He would not talk to her directly, but he would hover nearby while she worked, watching everything she did with those serious gray eyes. Adelaide pretended not to notice. She just talked to him while she worked, her voice easy and conversational. She told him about growing up in County Cork, where the grass was so green it hurt your eyes. She told him about the ocean voyage to America, the huge waves and the cramped quarters, and the excitement of seeing the Statue of Liberty for the first time. She told him about learning to make bread from a neighbor in Philadelphia who barely spoke English. They had communicated mostly through gestures and laughter, and somehow the bread had turned out perfect anyway. Thomas listened to every word. One afternoon, Grant came in from the fields to find them in the garden behind the house. Adelaide was on her knees in the dirt, showing Thomas how to plant herb seedlings. This one is basil. She held up a small green plant. It smells like summer. And this one is oregano. It is good in tomato sauce. Thomas reached out and touched the basil leaves with one finger. Mama used to grow herbs. It was the first time he had mentioned Sarah to anyone other than Emma. Adelaide nodded. She must have had a beautiful garden. Thomas looked up at her with something that was not quite trust but was no longer fear. It was over there. He pointed to a patch of ground near the fence that had gone wild with weeds. She let me help her water the plants. Would you like to help me water these ones? Thomas considered the question with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice deliberating a landmark case. Then he nodded. Grant watched them work together in the afternoon sunlight, Adelaide's auburn hair catching gold highlights as she guided Thomas's small hands through the watering process. And he felt something he had not felt in 6 months. Hope. The transformation happened so gradually that Grant almost did not notice it at first. It started with the smell. For months, the house had smelled like dust and old coffee and the faint mustiness of rooms that had not been properly aired. Grant had grown so accustomed to it that he no longer registered the odor. But one morning in early October, he walked through the front door and stopped dead in his tracks. Fresh bread, lemon soap, something floral that he could not identify but that made him think of spring meadows and Sunday mornings. The house smelled alive again. Adelaide was in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows as she kneaded dough on the wooden counter. Flour dusted her forearms and a streak of it marked her cheek where she had pushed back a loose strand of hair. She looked up when he entered and smiled. "You are back early. Finished the fencing faster than expected." Grant hung his hat on the hook by the door. His eyes traveled around the kitchen, taking in details he had somehow missed before. The dishes were washed and stacked neatly in the cupboard. The windows were clean enough that sunlight poured through unobstructed. The cobwebs that had stretched across the ceiling beams for months were gone. "You have been busy." Adelaide shrugged and went back to her kneading. "It is what you hired me to do." But it was more than that, and they both knew it. Over the following weeks, Grant watched as Adelaide methodically brought order to the chaos he had allowed to consume his home. The laundry that had piled up in corners was washed and folded and put away in drawers. The floors were swept and mopped until they gleamed. The curtains were taken down and beaten free of dust and rehung with care. She even tackled Sarah's sewing room, the one space Grant had not been able to enter since the funeral. He came home one evening to find the door standing open and Adelaide inside, carefully organizing the fabric and thread and half-finished projects that Sarah had left behind. Grant stood in the doorway, unable to move or speak. Adelaide looked up and saw his face. Her expression softened with understanding. "I can close it back up if you prefer." "I should have asked first." "No." The word came out rough and strange. "No, it is fine. It needed to be done." He turned and walked away before she could see the tears he was fighting to hold back. That night, for the first time since Sarah died, Grant dreamed of her without waking up in grief. In the dream, Sarah was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching Adelaide teach Emma how to measure flour for biscuits. She was smiling. "It is all right, Grant." She spoke without moving her lips, the way things happen in dreams. "You are allowed to let her help." When he woke, the sun was rising and the smell of fresh coffee was drifting up from the kitchen. He lay in bed for a long moment, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the dream had meant anything at all. The children continued to bloom under Adelaide's care. Emma's hair was now braided every morning, sometimes simply and sometimes in elaborate patterns that Adelaide had learned from other servants back in Philadelphia. The girl had stopped screaming about wanting Mama to do it. She had started asking Adelaide to teach her new styles instead. Thomas had come out of his shell in ways Grant had not thought possible. He talked now, actually talked, in full sentences instead of the monosyllabic responses he had given for months. His favorite subject was the herb garden. Adelaide had expanded it beyond the small plot she and Thomas had started. Now it covered most of the area where Sarah's garden had been, the weeds pulled and the soil turned, and new plants growing in tidy rows. "Papa, did you know that mint can take over a whole garden if you are not careful?" Thomas delivered this information at the dinner table one evening with the seriousness of a scholar presenting groundbreaking research. Grant pretended to be impressed. "I did not know that. Miss Adelaide says you have to plant it in pots so it stays where you put it. Otherwise, it spreads everywhere like gossip in a small town." Grant glanced at Adelaide, who was suddenly very focused on cutting her meat. "She says that, does she?" Adelaide looked up with a hint of a smile. "It is an accurate comparison." Grant found himself smiling back, and for a moment it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He started finding excuses to come inside during the day. He needed water. He forgot his gloves. He had to check on something in the barn that required walking through the kitchen. Adelaide saw through every single excuse, but she never called him on it. She would just hand him whatever he supposedly needed and return to her work, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Sometimes their hands would brush when she passed him a glass or a tool. The contact was brief and accidental, but Grant felt it like a brand. He told himself it meant nothing. She was the housekeeper. That was all. But at night, lying alone in the bed he had shared with Sarah for 10 years, he found himself thinking about auburn hair and green dresses and the way Adelaide's accent got stronger when she was tired. Mrs. Wagner did not wait long to share her opinions. She showed up unannounced one afternoon while Adelaide was hanging laundry behind the house and the children were playing in the yard. Grant answered the door and immediately wished he had pretended not to be home. Mrs. Wagner pushed past him into the kitchen, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail. The clean counters, the fresh flowers in a jar on the windowsill, the children's freshly mended clothes hanging by the fire to dry. She is settling in all right. It was not a question. It was an accusation. She is doing fine. Grant stayed in the doorway, hoping his body language would discourage a longer visit. Unmarried woman living under your roof, Mrs. Wagner's voice dropped to a stage whisper that could probably be heard in the next county. People are talking Grant Holloway. Let them. He kept his voice flat and his expression neutral. She is the housekeeper. That is all. Mrs. Wagner sniffed in a way that communicated exactly how much she believed that statement. If you say so, but mark my words, you are playing with fire. This town has standards. Sarah was barely cold in the ground, and now you have got some Irish girl cooking your meals and raising your children. It does not look proper. Grant felt his temper rise for the first time in months. Sarah would want her children taken care of. She would want this house to feel like a home again. And if the town has a problem with that, the town can mind its own business. Mrs. Wagner's eyes widened. In all the years she had known Grant, he had never spoken to her with that kind of heat. Well, she gathered her dignity like a shawl. I can see I am not welcome here. I only came out of concern for your reputation. My reputation will survive. Grant opened the door wider. Thank you for stopping by, Mrs. Wagner. After she left, Adelaide emerged from the pantry where she had clearly been listening to every word. I can move back to the boarding house. Her voice was carefully neutral. If my being here is causing trouble for you, you are not going anywhere. The words came out sharper than Grant intended. He softened his tone. You are good for the kids, good for the house. People can think whatever they want to think. It does not change anything. Adelaide studied him for a long moment. Her green eyes seemed to see straight through to the loneliness he tried so hard to bury under work and responsibility. All right, then. She finally smiled. I will stay. Spring pushed into Colorado like a guest who had overstayed their welcome in some other place and was determined to make up for lost time. The snow melted in the higher pastures, sending streams of cold water rushing down toward the valley. The trees along the creek burst into bloom almost overnight, white and pink blossoms scattering in the wind like confetti. Grant had always loved spring on the ranch. It was the season of new calves and green grass and days that stretched longer with each passing week. But this spring felt different. This spring felt like possibility. The cattle drive was coming up. Every year, Grant and his hands moved the herd to the higher pastures where the grass was thicker and the water was cleaner. It took nearly 2 weeks of hard riding and harder work. 2 weeks away from the ranch, 2 weeks away from Adelaide and the children. Grant found himself dreading it in ways he never had before. The night before he was scheduled to leave, he could not sleep. He gave up trying around midnight and walked downstairs to sit on the porch, hoping the cool night air would settle his restless mind. Adelaide was already there. She sat on the top step with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, staring out at the darkening hills. The moon was half full, casting silver light across the yard and the barn and the mountains rising in the distance. Grant hesitated in the doorway. Mind if I join you? Adelaide looked over her shoulder and shook her head. Please. He lowered himself onto the step beside her. The wood creaked under his weight. The night was cool but not cold, the kind of spring night that promised warmer days ahead. Could not sleep either? Adelaide pulled her shawl tighter. Too much to think about, I suppose. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crickets singing in the grass and the distant call of a coyote somewhere in the hills. The sound was lonely and wild, like something that belonged to a world older than ranches and towns and human concerns. Grant was the first to speak. "You will be all right while I am gone. We will manage." Adelaide did not look at him when she answered. "I have done it before. The children and I have our routines now. We will be fine. I know you will." He meant it. In the months since Adelaide had arrived, she had proven herself more capable than anyone Grant had ever hired. She could handle anything the ranch threw at her. But that was not really why he had asked. "Can I ask you something?" Adelaide's voice was quiet in the darkness. "Go ahead. Why did you write to that woman?" "The mail-order bride." Grant rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he fell into whenever conversations got difficult. "I thought the children needed a mother. I thought I needed someone to share the load. Everything felt so impossible after Sarah died. I was drowning and I could not figure out how to swim." He paused, searching for words that did not want to come. "But it was not really about finding someone to help. Not entirely. I think I was looking for a reason to keep going. Something to build toward instead of just surviving day after day." Adelaide was quiet for a long moment. "But not for yourself." Grant turned to look at her. The moonlight caught the angles of her face, the curve of her cheek, the darkness of her eyes. "I did not figure I deserved anything for myself. Sarah was everything to me. It felt wrong to want anything after losing her. Grief does not work like that." Adelaide's voice was gentle but firm. "You are allowed to keep living, Grant. She would want you to." It was the first time she had used his first name without the Mr. in front of it. Grant felt something shift in his chest, like a door he had kept locked for months was finally creaking open. He wanted to take her hand. He wanted to close the small distance between them on the porch step. But the weight of propriety and fear and 6 months of loneliness held him back. Instead, he stood up, brushing imaginary dust from his trousers. "I should try to get some sleep. Long ride tomorrow." Adelaide rose as well, her shawl slipping from one shoulder. "Be careful out there, please. Always am." He tipped his hat to her and walked back into the house before he could say anything he might regret. But he felt her eyes on his back all the way down the hall. The cattle drive went wrong from the beginning. Rain moved in on the third day, turning the trail to mud and making the horses nervous. Two of the younger hands got separated from the group and had to be found. A dozen calves were swept downstream during a river crossing and barely rescued in time. By the 8th day, Grant was exhausted in body and spirit. He wanted nothing more than to be home, to see Adelaide's face when he walked through the door, to hear Emma's voice and feel Thomas's arms around his legs. Then the storm hit. It came fast and mean, rolling in from the west with almost no warning. Lightning split the sky like cracks in a mirror. Thunder shook the ground hard enough to make the horses scream. The herd spooked. In an instant, months of careful work scattered across the ravines and brush. Cattle ran in every direction, their eyes white with terror and their hooves churning up mud and rock. Grant spurred his horse after a group breaking for the canyon. The trail was slick with rain and barely visible in the darkness. He did not see the loose rock until his horse stumbled. The world tilted sideways. Grant felt himself falling, felt the impact of the ground against his shoulder with a crunch that seemed impossibly loud. Pain exploded through his arm and chest. He lay in the mud for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, staring up at the lightning tearing across the sky and wondering if this was how he was going to die. Then Dutch was there. His foreman appeared out of the darkness like some kind of guardian angel, his weathered face grim beneath his hat brim. "Boss, can you move?" Grant tried to push himself up and nearly blacked out from the pain. "Shoulder." Dutch grabbed him under his good arm and hauled him to his feet. The world spun and tilted. Grant would have fallen again if Dutch had not been holding him upright. "We need to get you to a doctor." The herd. Forget the damn herd. Dutch had never spoken to Grant like that before. The older man's voice was sharp with fear. "You are no good to anyone dead. Herd can wait. You cannot." The ride back to Redemption Flats was a blur of pain and darkness in the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. Grant drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he thought he heard Sarah's voice calling to him. Sometimes he thought he saw Adelaide standing in a field of wildflowers, her hand reaching out toward him. Dutch rode straight to the ranch instead of stopping in town. Later, Grant would learn that the foreman had sent one of the hands ahead to fetch the doctor while he focused on getting Grant home. They arrived after nightfall. Adelaide was waiting on the porch, a lantern in her hand, and her face pale as the moon overhead. She had clearly been watching for them, probably for hours. When she saw Grant slumped over his horse's neck, she dropped the lantern and ran. Between her and Dutch, they got him inside and onto his bed. Adelaide's hands were steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She cut away his shirt and gasped at the already darkening bruise spreading across his shoulder and chest. The doctor arrived within the hour. Old Dr. Finch had been practicing in Redemption Flats for 40 years. He smelled like whiskey and peppermint, and his hands shook slightly when he examined Grant's shoulder. But his diagnosis was swift and certain. Dislocated, and you have got a nasty cut from where you landed on the rocks. Going to hurt like hell when I said it. Grant looked past the doctor to where Adelaide stood at the foot of the bed. Her green dress was stained with mud and what might have been his blood. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung wild around her shoulders. She had never looked more beautiful. The children, they are fine. Adelaide moved to his side and took his good hand in both of hers. I sent them to Dutch's wife for the night. They do not need to hear this. Grant squeezed her fingers. Stay. Adelaide nodded, her jaw set with determination. I am right here. I am not going anywhere. When Dr. Finch wrenched the shoulder back into place, Grant's vision went white. He heard his own strangled shout echoing off the walls, felt Adelaide's grip tighten around his hand until his bones creaked. Then the darkness pulled him under, and he knew nothing more. Grant drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. The cut on his arm had become infected, sending his temperature soaring and his mind wandering through landscapes that made no sense. In his fever dreams, Sarah came to him often. Sometimes she was angry, demanding to know why he was giving up. Sometimes she was gentle, smoothing his hair back from his forehead and telling him to rest. Once, she stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching Adelaide change his bandages. She is good. Sarah's voice was quiet, without jealousy or accusation. Yes. Grant heard himself answer even though he knew he was dreaming. Sarah smiled, the same smile she had given him on their wedding day, the one that had made him feel like the luckiest man in Colorado. Do not make her wait too long. Life is shorter than you think. Then she was gone and Grant was alone in the darkness again. Adelaide never left his side. She slept in a chair beside his bed, her neck bent at angles that would cause her pain for days. She fed him broth and willow bark tea and cool water when the fever spiked. She changed his bandages with hands that had grown practiced at the task, and she talked to him. Even when he was too deep in the fever to respond, she kept talking. She told him about her childhood in Ireland, about the green hills and the cold sea and the father she had lost to consumption when she was 12. She told him about the long journey to America, packed into the belly of a ship with hundreds of other hopeful souls. She told him about Philadelphia, about the wealthy family who had hired her as a housemaid and eventually promoted her to governess, about the children she had cared for and come to love. She did not tell him about why she left. Not yet. But Grant heard enough through the fever haze to understand that her departure had not been her choice. On the third morning, the fever finally broke. Grant opened his eyes to pale sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of willow bark tea. His shoulder throbbed with a deep, persistent ache, but the sharp agony had faded to something almost manageable. Adelaide was still in the chair beside his bed. She looked exhausted. Her green dress was rumpled from days of wearing, and dark circles shadowed her eyes like bruises. Her hair had given up all pretense of being pinned and hung in loose waves around her face. When she saw him looking at her, relief flooded her features. You are awake. How long? Grant's voice came out rough and strange, like it belonged to someone else. 3 days. Adelaide set down the book she had been reading and leaned forward to press her hand against his forehead. The fever broke last night, but I wanted to make sure. How do you feel? Like I got trampled by my own herd. Grant tried to push himself up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his shoulder, making him gasp. Adelaide was on her feet in an instant. Do not try to move. Dr. Finch said you need at least a week of rest before you can even think about getting out of bed. She pressed a cup to his lips. Drink. You have not had anything but broth for 3 days. The tea was bitter, but Grant swallowed it without complaint. The liquid soothed his dry throat and settled warm in his stomach. When he finished, Adelaide set the cup aside and just looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "The children? They are fine. I told them you got hurt, but you were going to be all right. Emma made you a drawing." Adelaide pointed to a piece of paper tacked to the wall near his bed. Grant turned his head carefully and saw a crayon rendering of what appeared to be a man on a horse with the words "Get well, Papa" written across the top in Emma's careful handwriting. Thomas picked wildflowers from the garden. Adelaide's voice softened. "He insisted I put them in a jar by your bed so they would be the first thing you saw when you woke up." Grant looked at the small mason jar on his nightstand. A handful of dandelions and purple clover clustered together, already starting to wilt. Something hot and tight built in his chest. "They were so scared, Grant." Adelaide's composure finally cracked. "I was so scared. When Dutch rode up with you half dead on that horse, I thought for certain I was about to watch you die." "Adelaide, do not," her voice broke on the word, "do not say something kind right now. I cannot bear it. I have been sitting here for 3 days thinking about losing you, and I barely know you, and that terrifies me. It terrifies me how much it would hurt to lose someone I barely know." Grant reached out with his good hand and caught her wrist. His grip was weak from days of fever, but she stilled instantly at his touch. He pulled her hand to his chest and held it over his heart, letting her feel the steady beat beneath her palm. "You know me." The words came out quiet but certain. "You know me better than anyone has in a long time. And I know you. I know you sing Irish songs when you think no one is listening. I know you cannot stand the taste of turnips, but you make them anyway because Thomas likes them. I know you cry sometimes at night when you think the house is asleep." Adelaide stared at him with tears streaming down her face. "This is complicated. I know. The town already talks about us. This will make it worse. I do not care." Grant meant it. Somewhere between her arrival and this moment, Adelaide had become essential, not just to the house or the children, to him. "I do not care what they say, Adelaide. Let them talk until their jaws fall off. It does not change what I know to be true." Adelaide leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his good shoulder. He felt her whole body trembling. "I left Philadelphia because the husband tried to force himself on me." The words came out muffled against his shirt, but Grant heard every one. "Mrs. Ashford found us in his study. He had me backed against the wall and was tearing at my dress. And instead of being angry at him, she was angry at me. She said I must have encouraged him. She called me a harlot and a whore and sent me away with nothing but a reference letter and train fare." Grant felt rage building in his chest like a brush fire. "She lied in the letter, said the family was moving to France. It was easier than admitting what her husband had done, easier than letting anyone know that the respectable Theodore Ashford was the kind of man who attacked the help." Adelaide lifted her head and met his eyes. Her face was blotchy from crying, her nose red, her expression raw and vulnerable. "I came here thinking I would start over, be invisible, earn my keep, and never let anyone close enough to hurt me again." She drew a shaky breath. "But I do not want to be invisible with you, Grant." Grant used his good arm to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that slipped down her cheek. "Then do not be." She kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, a question more than a statement. Her lips were salty with tears and warm against his. Grant answered with everything he had. His good hand slid into her hair, scattering the last of her pins to the floor. She made a small sound against his mouth. Surprise and longing and relief all tangled together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adelaide laughed through her tears. "Your shoulder. Worth it." Grant pulled her close again, ignoring the protest from his injured body. "Absolutely worth it." Recovery was slow and frustrating. Grant had never been good at staying still. The ranch demanded constant attention, constant movement. Lying in bed while his shoulder healed went against every instinct he possessed. But Adelaide managed him with the same patient efficiency she had shown the children when she first arrived. She changed his bandages twice a day, her touch gentle but sure. She brought him meals that actually appealed to his appetite, instead of the thin broths Dr. Finch recommended. She sat beside him in the evenings and read aloud from books she borrowed from the church library. and she did not let him brood. Whenever Grant started to spiral into frustration or self-pity, Adelaide would find some way to pull him back. Sometimes it was a story about her childhood in Ireland that made him laugh despite himself. Sometimes it was bringing the children in to visit, their small bodies piling onto the bed beside him, while they reported on everything happening outside. Emma had taken over feeding the chickens. She described this responsibility with the gravity of someone entrusted with a sacred mission. I count them every morning, Papa, all 17, and I make sure they have fresh water even when it is cold outside. Thomas had appointed himself guardian of the herb garden. He gave daily reports on which plants were thriving and which needed extra attention. The basil is not happy. I think it needs more sun. Miss Adelaide says we can move it to a better spot when the ground warms up more. Grant listened to their chatter and felt something he had not felt in over a year. Connected. He was not just surviving anymore. He was not just going through the motions of fatherhood while secretly drowning in grief. He was present, really present, for the first time since Sarah died. Dutch came by weekly to report on the ranch. The foreman was not a man of many words, but he conveyed everything Grant needed to know in his laconic updates. The herd had been recovered, minus a dozen head that had probably ended up in the next county. The hands were managing fine. Spring planting was on schedule. Everything was under control. On his fourth visit, Dutch lingered in the doorway after delivering his report. Got something to say? Grant was sitting up in bed now, his shoulder bound, but no longer throbbing with every heartbeat. Dutch shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. That woman of yours, she is something special. She is not my woman. Grant said it automatically, the denial that had become habit over months of deflecting Mrs. Wagner's questions. Dutch snorted. Sure she is not, and I am the Queen of England. He jerked his chin toward the window, where Adelaide was visible in the yard, helping Emma hang laundry. She kept this place running while you were laid up, handled everything. The children, the house, even some of the ranch hands who came by with questions. Never lost her temper once. Never asked for help she did not need. Grant watched Adelaide through the window. The spring sunlight caught her auburn hair, turning it to fire. She worked for fine people back east. She knows how to manage. She knows how to manage, Dutch agreed, but that is not why she did it. He gave Grant a long look. Do not let her slip away, boss. Women like that do not come around twice. After Dutch left, Grant spent a long time staring at the ceiling. He thought about Sarah, about the life they had built together and the future they had planned, about the children she had given him and the love they had shared. He thought about the past year, the grief that had nearly swallowed him whole, the desperate letter to a stranger in St. Louis, the way he had convinced himself that he was looking for a mother for his children when really he had been looking for permission to keep living. And he thought about Adelaide, the way she had walked into his broken house and made it whole again, the way she had reached his children when he could not, the way she had sat beside his bed for 3 days, refusing to let him slip away into the darkness. Sarah had been his first love, his best love, the woman who had taught him what it meant to belong to someone completely. But Sarah was gone, and Adelaide was here. Grant was not replacing one with the other. He understood that now. Love was not a zero-sum game where caring for someone new meant betraying someone old. Love was just love. It grew where it found purchase, like wildflowers in rocky soil. When Adelaide came to check on him that evening, Grant reached out and took her hand before she could start fussing with his bandages. I have been thinking, that sounds dangerous. She smiled, but her eyes were watchful. About us. The smile faded. Adelaide tried to pull her hand back, but Grant held on. Grant, we should not. Why not? Because, she looked away, her jaw tight. Because you are still grieving. Because I work for you. Because the town already thinks the worst, and this would only prove them right. Do you care what the town thinks? I care about protecting you. About protecting the children. Grant tugged on her hand until she met his eyes. What about protecting yourself? Adelaide's composure cracked, just for a moment. I stopped caring about myself a long time ago. When Mrs. Ashford threw me out, I decided that the only way to survive was to not want anything, not to hope for anything, because hoping just meant more ways to be disappointed. And now, Adelaide's voice dropped to a whisper. Now I want things I have no right to want. You have every right. Grant pulled her down to sit beside him on the bed. You have every right to want a home, a family, someone who sees you for exactly who you are and counts himself lucky every single day. He cupped her face with his good hand. I see you, Adelaide, and I count myself lucky. She kissed him then, and there was nothing tentative about it. This was claiming, choosing, building something new from the ruins of what came before. When they finally pulled apart, Adelaide was crying it again. But this time the tears were different. This time they looked like hope. 6 weeks after the accident, Grant walked into Redemption Flats with Adelaide at his side. It was Sunday morning. The church bells were ringing across town, calling the faithful to worship. The streets were quiet except for families making their way toward the white steepled building at the end of Main Street. Grant had left Emma and Thomas with Dutch and his wife for the afternoon. He wanted to do this properly. He wanted to do this right. Their first stop was Wagner's General Store. The building was closed for the Sabbath, but Mrs. Wagner was sitting on the porch in her rocking chair, watching the town go by like a queen surveying her kingdom. When she saw Grant and Adelaide approaching, she raised one silver eyebrow. Well, well, well. Her voice carried across the street. Look who finally crawled out of his sickbed. Grant stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Mrs. Wagner. Nice morning. It is. She looked from Grant to Adelaide and back again. Her eyes missed nothing, as usual, the way their shoulders brushed as they walked, the matching expressions of nervous determination on their faces. Something you want to tell me? Yes, ma'am. Grant took a breath. We are heading to see Pastor Dennison. Wanted you to know first, seeing as you are the one who pointed Adelaide my way. Mrs. Wagner's eyebrow climbed higher. Are you now? She rocked slowly in her chair for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying Adelaide with fresh intensity. You love him? The question was directed at Adelaide, blunt and unapologetic. Adelaide lifted her chin. Yes, ma'am, I do. And those children? I love them too, as if they were my own. Mrs. Wagner nodded slowly. Then she rose from her chair and came down the steps with surprising speed for a woman her age. Before Adelaide could react, she found herself wrapped in a fierce hug. About damn time. Mrs. Wagner's voice was gruff but not unkind. The whole town has been speculating for months. Might as well give them something real to talk about. Adelaide laughed and hugged her back. Thank you for everything. Mrs. Wagner pulled back and fixed Grant with a stern look. You treat her right, Grant Holloway. She is too good for you by half. Yes, ma'am. Grant felt something loosen in his chest. I know she is. They walked to the church at the end of Main Street, their footsteps falling into matching rhythm on the wooden boardwalk. The building was small and white, with a steeple that reached toward the Colorado sky like a prayer made physical. Grant had been coming here since he was a boy. He had married Sarah in this church. He had buried her from it 6 months later. Pastor Dennison was waiting on the front steps. He was a thin man with kind eyes and gray hair that had gone completely white in the past year. He had been ministering to Redemption Flats for nearly 25 years. He knew every family, every scandal, every secret. Grant. The pastor's handshake was firm despite his frail appearance. Mrs. Wagner's grandson came running ahead to warn me you might be coming. Grant shook his head. That woman has spies everywhere. She cares about you. Pastor Dennison turned to Adelaide and took her hand in both of his. And you must be Miss Brennan. I have heard a great deal about you. All of it good. Adelaide blushed. Thank you, Reverend. Pastor Dennison led them inside the church and down the aisle to a small office at the back. The room was cramped but comfortable, lined with books and filled with the smell of old paper and candle wax. He gestured for them to sit in the 2 chairs facing his desk. So, he settled into his own chair with a small sigh. Tell me what you are wanting. Grant reached over and took Adelaide's hand. We want to get married, properly, with the children there and anyone else who wants to come. Pastor Dennison nodded slowly. I buried Sarah. He spoke the words gently without accusation. I baptized both your children. I have watched you struggle through the darkest year of your life. He leaned forward, his kind eyes moving between them. Are you sure you are ready for this, Grant? Not because you need help with the house or the children, but because you truly want to build a life with this woman. Grant did not hesitate. I am sure. He squeezed Adelaide's fingers. Sarah was the love of my life. That does not change. But she is gone and I am still here, and I have spent the past year feeling guilty for wanting to keep living. His voice roughened. Adelaide helped me see that I was not betraying Sarah by caring for someone new. I was honoring her. She would have wanted the children to have a mother who loves them. She would have wanted me to have someone to share the load. She would have wanted us all to be happy. Pastor Dennison turned to Adelaide. And you, Miss Brennan, what are your intentions? Adelaide straightened in her chair. I came to Colorado running from my past. I thought if I could just find somewhere quiet to work, somewhere I would not have to explain myself, I could survive. I was not looking for love. I was not looking for family. She glanced at Grant, her eyes bright. But love found me anyway. In that broken house with those hurting children and their father who was trying so hard to hold everything together. Her voice steadied. I want to be Grant's wife. I want to be Emma and Thomas's mother. I want to spend the rest of my life building something good from all the broken pieces. Pastor Dennison sat back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well then, he reached for a calendar on his desk. How does 2 weeks from today sound? Adelaide looked at Grant, her face lit with joy. 2 weeks, unless you want to wait longer? No, Grant lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. 2 weeks is perfect. The wedding was held on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. The church was decorated with wildflowers that Thomas had helped Adelaide pick from the fields behind the ranch. White ribbons hung from the pews, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the space with golden warmth. The guest list was small: Dutch and his wife, Mrs. Wagner dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, a handful of neighbors who had proven themselves kind over the years. But to Grant, the church felt full. Adelaide came down the aisle in a simple cream-colored dress she had made herself. Her auburn hair was loose around her shoulders, crowned with a wreath of the same wildflowers that decorated the pews. Emma walked beside her as flower girl, scattering petals with more enthusiasm than precision. The girl was beaming so wide it looked like her face might split in two. Thomas stood at the front of the church next to Grant. He had insisted on being part of the ceremony, though he was not entirely sure what his role was supposed to be. He had settled for holding his father's hand and watching everything with solemn attention. When Adelaide reached the altar, Grant felt his breath catch. She was beautiful, not in the polished way of society ladies or the painted way of saloon girls. Beautiful in the way of morning sunlight and mountain streams and all the wild things that made Colorado home. Pastor Dennison began the ceremony. The words were traditional, the same words Grant had spoken once before in this very church. But they felt different now. Not lesser, but different. The first time had been about beginning. This time was about continuing, about choosing to go on even when the path was hard. Do you, Grant Holloway, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part? I do. Grant's voice was steady. And do you, Adelaide Brennan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part? I do. Adelaide's voice was clear as a bell. Then by the power vested in me by God in the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Pastor Dennison smiled. You may kiss your bride. Grant pulled Adelaide into his arms and kissed her with all the tenderness and hunger of a man who had thought he would never feel this way again. The small gathering erupted in applause. Emma threw her remaining flower petals into the air like confetti. Thomas tugged on Grant's coat until his father bent down to include him in the embrace. For one perfect moment, standing in that sun-filled church with his new wife and his children pressed against him, Grant felt completely whole. The celebration at the ranch lasted until the stars came out. Dutch had organized a small party in the yard, with lanterns strung between the barn and the house, and food spread across tables made from sawhorses and planks. There was music from an old fiddle that one of the ranch hands knew how to play, and dancing on the packed dirt that served as a dance floor. Emma stayed up past her bedtime, too excited to sleep. Thomas fell asleep on a blanket near the fire, surrounded by the sound of laughter and celebration. Grant danced with Adelaide under the Colorado sky, holding her close and breathing in the scent of wildflowers in her hair. Happy? He asked the question against her ear, speaking softly so only she could hear. Adelaide tilted her head back to look at him. I never thought I would have this. Her voice was quiet with wonder. A home, a family, someone who loves me for exactly who I am. Grant pulled her closer. Get used to it. When the last of the guests had gone home and the lanterns had been extinguished, Grant carried Thomas to bed while Adelaide helped a yawning Emma into her nightgown. They met in the hallway outside the children's rooms. They are both out. Adelaide's voice was soft. Emma asked if she could call me Mama now. I told her she could call me whatever felt right. What did she decide? Mama Adelaide. Grant reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. That sounds about right. They walked together to the bedroom that had been Grant's alone since Sarah died. The room had been cleaned and aired, fresh sheets on the bed and new curtains on the windows. Adelaide had done it herself, transforming the space from a shrine to grief into something that felt like a beginning. Adelaide paused in the doorway. Are you sure about this? Grant took her hand and drew her inside. I have never been more sure of anything. He closed the door behind them. They came together slowly that night, learning each other's bodies like sacred texts written in a language only they could read. Adelaide's skin was soft under his calloused hands. Her sighs and whispers filled the darknesses like music. Grant had been afraid that making love to someone new would feel like betrayal. Instead, it felt like resurrection, like coming back to life after a long time wandering in shadows. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight. The window was open to let in the cool night air and the endless song of crickets in the grass. Grant traced idle patterns on Adelaide's shoulder. I love you. He said it simply, without fanfare. I know I have not said it before. I know I have been scared to say it, but I want you to hear the words. Adelaide propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. I love you too. Her voice was steady. I did not mean to. I came here planning to work and save money and never let anyone close. But then there you were with your sad eyes and your broken house and your beautiful children. And I was lost from the first week. Grant pulled her down for a kiss. Best thing that ever happened to me. That mail-order bride not showing up. Adelaide laughed against his lips. Do not let Mrs. Wagner hear you say that. She will take all the credit. She deserves some of it. Grant held Adelaide close, feeling her heartbeat slow as sleep began to take her. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something other than guilt when he thought about the future. He felt hope. 3 months after the wedding, Adelaide stood on the porch at dawn. She had Grant's coffee mug warming her hands and a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the autumn chill. The first snow of the season dusted the distant mountains, and frost clung to the grass in the yard like lace. Inside the house, she could hear Emma and Thomas starting to stir. Their voices drifted through the walls, the easy chatter of children who felt safe and loved. Grant emerged from the barn, leading his horse toward the corral. When he saw Adelaide watching, he smiled. That smile still made her heart skip, even after all these months. He changed direction and climbed the porch steps to stand beside her. Morning, Mrs. Holloway. Adelaide would never tire of hearing that name. Morning. Grant kissed her temple, then wrapped his arms around her from behind. They stood like that for a long moment, watching the sun climb over the hills and paint the world in shades of gold and amber. The ranch spread out before them. The barn, the corrals, the pastures stretching toward the mountains. Imperfect and demanding and beautiful. This was home. Emma wants to learn to ride. Adelaide spoke without turning around. Really ride, not just sit in the saddle while you lead her around. She is ready. Grant's voice was warm against her ear. I have been thinking the same thing. Maybe this spring when the ground is not so hard. Adelaide smiled. And Thomas asked me something last night. Oh? He wanted to know if he could call me Mama. Grant's arms tightened around her. What did you tell him? I told him he could call me whatever felt right. Adelaide turned in his embrace to face him. He thought about it for a long time and then he said he wanted to call me Mama Adelaide, like a compromise. So he can still remember his first mama, but also have me. Grant cupped her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. That boy is smarter than both of us put together. He gets it from his father. Adelaide smiled. Grant laughed, and the sound filled the morning air like music. The mail-order bride never arrived. Adelaide spoke the words softly like a benediction. Grant looked down at her, his eyes full of love and gratitude, and something that looked like peace. No, she did not. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Someone better showed up instead. The sun broke free of the horizon, spilling light across the porch in their joined hands and the life they had built from nothing but need and hope and the willingness to try again. Inside, the children called for breakfast. The day was beginning, full of ordinary miracles, horses to feed and lessons to teach and meals to cook and moments to cherish. A life made up of small things that added together into something extraordinary. Adelaide kissed her husband once more. Then she took his hand and led him inside toward the noise and warmth and beautiful chaos of the family they had chosen to become. The past was written. Sarah's memory lived on in her children's eyes and in the love Grant carried for her still, tucked safe in a corner of his heart where it would never fade. But the future was waiting, and Adelaide intended to meet it head-on, with her husband beside her and her children growing strong, and this house finally feeling like what it was always meant to be, a home, not because the walls were sound or the roof was solid or the land was good, but because the people inside loved each other. And in the end, that was all that mattered. And Adelaide stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Grant lift Thomas onto his shoulders while Emma set the table for breakfast. The smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the air. Sunlight streamed through clean windows. Laughter echoed off the walls. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived in Redemption Flats, broken and scared and convinced that wanting anything was just another way to get hurt. She thought about the life she had now, the husband who looked at her like she had hung the moon, the children who called her Mama Adelaide and fought over who got to sit next to her at dinner, the community that had slowly, grudgingly accepted her as one of their own. She had come here running from her past. She had found her future instead. Grant looked up and caught her watching. He smiled that rare, genuine smile, the one she had learned to treasure. "You coming?" Adelaide smiled back. "I am already here." She crossed the kitchen and took her place at the table, surrounded by her family. Outside, the Colorado sun continued its climb into a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The mountains stood eternal on the horizon. The world went on as it always did, indifferent to the small dramas of human hearts. But here, in this house, everything was different. Everything was exactly as it should be.